Now, to show that you can also improve dramatically at chess, even when you reach your 30s and 40s. Next game is from Chibolo1. He likes to play on chess.com, and he's become totally addicted. I think he's now worked something like 28,000 tactics. So, tactics and openings. Openings and tactics. That is how you can reach the next levels in chess. So let's take a look. He's taken the London system to heart. This is his go-to opening. And bishop f4, the modern version of the London system. c5, e3, e6. Now, of course, with e6, black sets up the classical pawn formation. c3, white sets up the standard London pawn triangle with the bishop outside the pawn chain. Knight c6 and knight d2. Notice white refrains from popping the knight out to f3, and this game is a textbook example of exactly why. Bishop d6. Black offers the early exchange of bishops. Now, as a rule, when they offer the exchange of bishops, white has three options. A. Trade. B. Pull the bishop back to g3. C. Let the bishop sit there. And after takes, take on double pawns. And now in this case, though, of course, you have to decide what to do with your d-pawn. Well, there is actually a d option sometimes. If black has a knight on f6, on occasion you may flip your bishop up to g5 and apply the pin. Now in this case, we have this specific position in mind. We have a game plan. We play bishop takes, queen takes, and the excellent f4 exclamation point. What's the point? Well, the point is we want to put this guy back here on lockdown, and we set up our nice, beautiful stonewall pawn formation where we've gotten rid of our dark squared bishop. If you compare this to the stonewall Dutch defense that we studied earlier, this is like a stonewall Dutch defense on steroids, if you will. Now, in fact, this has been seen in 2016 in two games by super grandmasters. Grandmaster Vladimir Kramnik against Niels Grangelis, where Kramnik won a queen. Actually, queens came off early in that game, and he won a rook and knight versus rook and knight in game, brilliantly. And Gata Kamsky against GM Wang Yu in the World Mind Games in Beijing 2016. In that game, Gata took it all the way down to where he had rook and bishop, good bishop, versus rook and bad bishop, and black never overcame his positional deficiencies and ultimately even lost the bishop ending. So, this is all part of our dark square strategy. And we put the grip down, we put the clamp down on the E5 square. Now, both of those games will be at the end of this accompanying database file. We're not going to go over those two games here because they're covered in the big mega series on London. But the key idea is F4 clamping down on the E5 square. You can see we have our dark square pawn chain, and black has his bad light square bishop. Let's take a look at how Chibolo executes the strategy. Well, knight out, bishop to d7, and bishop to d3. Pawn takes on d4, a very timely capture by black, because you're not really able to take with this pawn without losing the f4 pawn. So after c takes d4, now black plays h6. Not really sure what that's all about. Maybe expecting white to castle kingside, and then he was going to play some g5 action. But a3. This is the same move that Kramnik and Kamsky used in their game. The idea is more pawns on dark squares and the possibility of pawn to b4 gaining space on the queen side, or possibly even kicking the knight from c6 at the right moment. And very useful for a couple of reasons. One, you keep the queen and the knight off the b4 square, but in the case that black has visions of queenside castling, you're ready to launch with b4, cartwheel the knight maybe to b3 to c5, and go for his king. Well, a6. But what does that do? That places another pawn on the same color as his bishop. Rook to c1, not rushing to castle kingside. Queen e7, and knight to e5. Now this is very nice because black is unable to exchange knights and then chill with the knight back to d7 because the d7 square is occupied. From the e5 outpost, you can see this knight influences 4 key squares on the black side of the board: c6, d7, f7, and g6. Well, not wanting to rush rook c8, but now we know black's not castling queenside, so it's safe to castle. And now knight takes e5, pawn takes e5. Interesting recapture, but by doing that, white gets the d4 square for his knight. Now, notice that white doesn't rush to exchange rooks, because that would allow the bishop to pull back, and then when you recapture, then the knight would get a very nice natural square. Instead, with the immediate recapture, the knight is forced to either retreat or to lurch forward and possibly sack a pawn. Now in the game, he played knight e4, giving up a pawn. Black decides to play actively and sacrifice a pawn. But what were the alternatives? Well, knight to g8 is just downright unappetizing because then the rook is boxed in the corner and the knight needs another 2 moves to get out. Trading rooks was an option, and then on queen takes, knight up to g4. But then knight to b3 would be convenient, and on h5, making a retreat for the square, h3, knight h6, and queen to c7, you can see white has a pretty serious initiative going. In the game, after knight e4, well, first the trade of rooks to deactivate the black bishop, and simply grabbing the pawn. Now, of course, you could take it with the bishop and plunk your knight in on d6 as well, but this is fine. White has a solid extra pawn and better bishop. In fact, according to Fritz, white actually has a 2-point advantage, not just 1 point. Well, black castles. At the price of a pawn, black has managed to get castled. Now, queen c2. Key moment in the game in trying to convert white's advantage. With queen c2, white plays to open the c-file, control the open c-file, and exploit the lack of mobility of the light-squared bishop. But queen d6 is also possible, and on queen takes, pawn takes, you now have a passed pawn, but it is also a bit extended. For example, though, after rook d8, you would play rook c1 exclamation point, noticing you're using tactics to hold on to the pawn. The idea then would you would follow with king f8 with rook c7. So that was definitely another way to go, but queen c2 was quite nice as well. King h1, and then rook to c1. Now with rook to c1, you have the immediate tactical threat, takes, check, and checkmate. Notice this bishop on e4 is totally dominant. Now after rook to c1, well, black could play queen back to d8, but it's certainly unpleasant. And on g6, simply penetration to the 7th rank would be quite strong. In the game, after rook c1, black played queen d8, protecting everything. But then came queen c5, just keeping an eye on the rook over on f8. Queen c7 was also possible, and in fact after rook e8, then queen c7. which now touches the f7 pawn, and the b7 pawn is twice attacked. Well, here black goes in for a counterattack. And since he's at this point unable to defend his b7 and f7 pawns, the black queen counterattacks the pawn base on e3 with check. Note, instead they exchange of queens. Queen takes, rook takes. Well, once again, two pawns are under attack. King g8, bishop takes, rook d8, simply king f2, rook check, and king to f3 gives white a 2-pawn plus winning rook endgame. In the game, queen to d2 was met with a very strong counterblow. The nice queen sacrifice. Queen takes c8, double exclamation point. This exploits the back rank and vulnerability of the black king. Queen takes e3 check. King slides over to h1. Now the white king hides in the corner, and this leaves the black rook on e8, still under attack. Well, the rook tries to hide because, of course, if rook takes c8, checkmate. After king h1, the rook tries to hide over on g8. But now we get a defender elimination, queen sacrifice. Simply, bam! Queen takes g8 check, double exclamation point. King takes, and rook to c8 mate. A very nice rook plus bishop checkmate. But also an excellent example of how preparation can pay. And being familiar with the idea of how to meet bishop d6, a logical move by black, looking to exchange bishops, with bishop takes, queen takes, and f4, having been familiar with the games of Vladimir Kramnik and Gadakamsky in this variation, white felt very comfortable playing against this idea for black. And now I'm sure you will as well. Now the next game I wanted to show is from my Miami Country Day School chess summer camp. In order to teach the campers about the London system, I did a small simul against, I think it was about 6 of them, and that way they got to appreciate some of the difficulties that black might face in the London system. Well, one of the best and brightest students was Robbie Kramer, and Robbie himself soon took up the London system with tremendous success in his own practice. In our game, d4, d5, bishop f4, e6, e3, and an interesting idea, bishop d6, immediately offering to exchange bishops. Now, I went ahead and just played c3, setting up my dark square pawn triangle. Notice that in this scenario, well, knight d7, knight f3, knight e7, bishop to d3. Now, what I wanted to point out is in this scenario, when the black pawn is still on c7, there's not much to be gained by playing bishop takes on d6, because after pawn takes d6, the black pawns cover a lot of central squares. And note in particular the pawn on d6 covers the dark squares on c5 and e5. That's not really what white wants to achieve. Therefore, we just continue our normal development. But now, Robbie plays bishop takes on f4, exchanging bishops. So after e takes f4, well, white has doubled f-pawns, but a very nice grip on the e5 square after e takes f4. This idea was seen in one of the original games where Akibai Rubinstein was playing white in the London system, in the London tournament, somewhere around 1922. That game will also be included in the database, historical game. Well, after e takes f4, castles, continued development, knight bd2, and now a6. And I consider a6 a little dubious because now black has 6 of his 7 pawns are on the same color as his bishop. Now, of course, if that bishop was out here on, say, g4 coming around at g6, that would be another story and probably perfectly acceptable. But as it is, the poor bishop is back here locked in behind his own pawns. Well, queen e2. This is a useful developing move as white keeps his castling options open just a little bit longer. And then comes b5. Well, once black weakens the queen side, he creates a target for white to attack. And now white knows what the strategy is. a4, exclamation point. With a4, white forces lines open on the queen side. You can see the pawn on b5 is under heavy fire. Well, black plays c6. And this further boxes in the bishop. And after c6, you can see all, well, 7 pawns now are on the color of the bishop. Okay, maybe a better try would have been to play b takes a4, rook takes a4, and then c5, and grabbing a little counterplay. This would have been better. But after c6, white went ahead and played b takes b4. Now, of course, white could have gone in for trying to grab a pawn with pawn takes, and bishop takes. But then rook b8, bishop a6, rook takes b2, and you've let the fox into the penthouse. And the extra pawn is not all that great of an extra pawn. So instead, strategic play with b4. Now black decides to play pawn takes on a4, but this was an ill-timed capture that leaves black with a backward pawn. Slightly preferable was knight to b6. Then pawn takes, and rook takes, and simply castles. Well, after castles, you can see the white knights have fantastic dark square prospects. One will go to b3, one will go to e5, the rook will go to a1, and black would still have this horrible bishop that would be nothing more than a passive defender for the foreseeable future. But in the game, after b takes a4, rook takes a4. Now we can see the bishop is still very boxed in, very passive. Well, knight to g6. This is a one-move threat on the f4 pawn. Well, white wants to play g3 and tighten things up anyway. And now notice that white has placed all of his pawns on dark squares, which is very complementary to having a light square bishop. Well, the knight rolls back to e7 and then castles. So white has completed his development, secured his king, and now he's ready to attack on the queen side. Knight to f6, rook at f to a1. You can see white has now 4 attackers zeroed in on the a6 pawn. Queen to d6. But first, knight to e5. A little delayed gratification, if you will. Since the black a6 pawn is frozen and cannot be defended, white goes ahead and improves the positioning of his knights. Bishop to b7. Well, not a big future for that guy. Knight to b3, exclamation point, more delayed gratification. The black pawn on a6 still cannot be guarded, so white improves the positioning of the remaining knight before trying to crash through on a6. Rook at f to c8, and knight to c5. Well, you can see white now has 5 hits on the a6 pawn, not to mention the b7 bishop is under attack. Well, rook at c to b8, and now finally, bam, bishop takes on a6. Well, with all of his forces optimally deployed, white finally captures the a6 pawn and crashes through along the open a file. Bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and rook takes. Well, the capture on a6 with the rook creates a lateral pin. Next target, of course, is the c6 pawn. Well, black plays h5, not realizing the danger, and he makes extended lift for his king on h7. But then comes b5 exclamation point. White has a simple plan, either winning the pawn on b6 or creating a monster past b pawn. You can see with the b5 move, White has 3 attackers on the c6 pawn. The only way for Black to defend the pawn would be rook to c8. But then change of plans, switch gears, and make a passed b pawn. And it would be a question of whether Black would be able to cope with this new white weapon. For example, rook to b8 and pawn to b7, queen to d8, queen to a2, knight to e8, scurrying over, rook to a8, knight goes to c7, evicting the rook. But then rook takes, queen takes, and knight at e to d7, blasting him out for an easy win. So after the move b5, putting more pressure on c6, I think we can ascertain that the Black position is quite hopeless. Well, in the game, rook takes b5, overlooking the lateral pin. So queen takes b5, winning a rook, and obviously crushing advantage. Now we could just discontinue here, but we'll just look at the last 5 moves or so of the game. Knight up to e4, not afraid to trade, check, and plucking a vital defensive pawn. King up, knight check. The king bravely goes forward, and rook over to f8. Checkmate was the finish. But what's the takeaway from the opening? The takeaway from the opening here is that when Black plays bishop to d6 and still has the pawn on c7, don't rush to capture. Because if you capture and they play c takes d6, their pawn configuration is very hard to exploit the double pawns, in fact, pretty much impossible. And those pawns cover a lot of squares in the center and take a lot of the punch out of White's punch bowl. So, pretty instructive game. After that, Robbie took up the London system and has tremendous success. Another thing that's very popular for Black players, especially at these levels, is an early knight to c6. I'm not a big fan of knight to c6 blocking in the Black c pawn, but we see it pretty often, I must say. The example we will look at here is Fayez versus Hanging Lamp, played on ChessKid.com 2018, a white victory in 28 moves. Now for the next game, we go back to Mr. Cibolo's game when he was back up around 1240. He's now 200 points higher, and was early stages of playing the London system. But here he does a very nice job of controlling the dark squares. His opponent played a bit weakly, losing time, but he capitalized quite nicely. Let's take a look. So, d4, d5, bishop f4, and knight c6. At the club level, we see a lot of the knight c6 blocking in the c7 pawn. Now, in and of itself, the move is not bad at all. If you follow with bishop f5 or bishop to g4, it's quite reasonable. However, it does block in the c7 pawn, and it makes it very easy for Black to just gradually drift into passivity, which is what we wind up seeing here. e3, knight f6, knight f3, and then e6. Well, as we said, the c8 bishop is now blocked in by his own pawns, and the c6 knight also blocks in the Black c7 pawn. That makes it very difficult for Black to fight against the white central presence. Well, knight bd2, and now a very strange move, bishop to b4. Well, that just is pretty useless and actually helps White because c3, we're more than happy to take the free tempo and build our own pawn triangle. Well, now the bishop goes back to d6. But remembering our lesson from the previous game, when Black has a pawn on c7, we do not want to trade on d6 because the pawn can recapture, and that'll help control these dark squares. So, just continue bishop to d3. And now Black trades bishops, which in and of itself, to move a bishop 1, 2, 3, to trade for a bishop that moved once, obviously is a clear loss of time. Even at that, the computers only consider that white has a slight edge. However, myself thoroughly love playing this type of position with white, which may be more important than the exact theoretical variation. So e takes f4. Already a promising start to the game for the white team. As you can see, white clearly has the better bishop. Well, castles, and again, like we saw last game, the flexible queen e2. Since black is going to have trouble generating anything on the queen side, white keeps his options open which way to go. Rook e8. Black lines up an x-ray on the white king and queen. However, the rook on e8 is really only well placed if black is in fact able to execute the e5 pawn advance. Otherwise, the rook on e8 does kind of leave the f7 pawn a bit weaker. Now, Magnus Carlsen, when he was playing online Banter Blitz, played a 3,000 rated player where he was trying to build up a kingside attack, and when the guy went rook e8, Magnus's comment was, "I simply cannot explain this move." But anyway, knight to e5. White occupies the e5 outpost and clogs up the e-file. Well, after knight takes, pawn takes, the rook on e8 really has very little function, and the knight on f6 is under attack. Okay, so the knight pulls back to d7, and white sees the chance to go ahead and get the big pawn center reinforced with f4. Well, queen check. We used to have a saying in the Houston Chess Club, Potzer sees check, Potzer gives check. And it's not really clear what black hoped to achieve with this check, but pawn to g3. White is more than happy to consolidate his considerable space advantage. Queen to h3, and now knight to f3. Well, knight to f3 is a little bit of a nasty knight to g5 threat, looking to exploit the black queen. So after knight to f3, f6, chipping away at the pawn, center, and keeping the knight from g5. But castle's queenside. White goes ahead and mobilizes for the coming action on the king side. Now, just a quick note here that after castle's queenside, if white is given a free hand, let's insert a couple of null moves. Well, I could see something like rook over. Maybe we'll insert one more null move and pawn to g4, and then whatever happens here, pawn takes pawn, for example, rook up to g3 would in fact trap the black queen, more or less. I guess she could still hang on with queen back to h6, but g5, queen up, and pawn takes pawn, and it's going to be a very difficult situation for the queen to extricate herself. Okay, typical idea, but not foolproof as the queen is still surviving. Anyway, after castles, black immediately goes astray. Pawn takes pawn on e5, opening the position when he still has all these pieces back here, undeveloped. He would have been better served by playing c5. Then on pawn takes, maybe a move like knight to h4, pawn takes on d4, and bishop to f5. This would be a very nice example of exploiting the queen's position on h3. So for example, after pawn takes, queen takes check, king up, rook to the file. You can see the black pieces simply are not well placed to defend their king. Pawn takes, rook check, queen over, threatening mate, king over, and black no longer has any defense against the coming rook takes on h7 checkmate. But once again, as we said in the game, f takes e5 was met by the killer knight to g5. The queen is threatened, the h7 pawn is threatened with check. Well, queen h6 is the only safe square for the black queen. And we must now tell you that it's probably good if there are no small children in the room, because what is about to follow is real carnage. First, bishop takes h7 check. King f8. Well, king h8 would have allowed the instantaneous knight fork. And after king f8, d takes e5. The advantage is already +3. But wait, it will get much worse. Knight to c5, and then h4, exclamation point. White plays to completely incarcerate the black queen. Well, b6, getting ready to come out, and h5. The white pieces now have really encroached on the black queen. She has no room, no oxygen. Well, after bishop a6, the white queen just slides up a notch. Black decides to make a little air for the queen with g6, but this does sacrifice a valuable kingside pawn. Simply bishop takes. White now has two connected passed pawns, and the black kingside pawns have pretty much been wiped out. Basically, all black has left over there is the king and queen. Rook at e to d8. Pawn to g4. b4 also is possible. But g4, bishop to b5, and now b4. Once the knight moves away, the e6 pawn falls as well. After king e7, but not rushing to grab material, pawn to g5. Queen to h8, pawn to f5. Well, you can see white has developed an absolute overwhelming force in material on the king side. It's pretty crushing. Well, black once again decides to save his rook. The knight pulls back. Now, he could have also gone on the immediate king hunt with f6, king e6, queen check, and checkmate. But instead, white played knight to d4, and I'm perfectly okay because at all times, he totally maintained control and kept a crushing position. But how many times do you see 4 pawns abreast and the enemy completely wiped out? Well, knight to d4 attacked the bishop. Pawn to c6. Pawn f6 check. Get them puppies rolling. Bishop back. King up. Takes. g6. e6 check. And at this point, a little desperation set in. But look at these 3 monster pawns just rolling along. Well, black tried to stem the tide with rook takes, but queen takes, knight check, king over, knight check, and pawn to g7. Last few moves, queen check, king up, and queen to g5 was a merciful end with queen to c8 check. So, part of the takeaway here is that to play strong, powerful attacking chess, you don't need super aggressive openings like the white side of a Sicilian. A few strategic mistakes by black, and as we saw in this game, white was able to develop just an absolute crushing kingside attack, totally devastating. And by the time you got to a position like e takes f4 and queen e2, white already had what he wanted. A grip on the dark squares, prospects against the black bishop, and then it was only a few more moves before the trademark knight e5, knight takes, pawn takes, and f4. White had a huge space advantage in the makings of a kingside attack. Of course, after the check, the block, and knight to f3, things were even more promising for the white team. So, well done, Mr. Cibolo. Good job on the dark squares and building the kingside attack. Now the next game is from the older of 2 young girls that I work with once a week on Sunday mornings. Both very bright, very intelligent, do very, very well in school, and their parents totally support their playing chess. Now, Faye S. is playing Hanging Lamp on ChessKid.com. This was in 2018. And here we see a different idea by Black. d4, d5, bishop f4, and 2 f6. Well, I guess this just reaffirms, once you think you've seen absolutely everything, there's always something new. So, what to do? Well, you have to keep playing good moves. e3, knight to c6, and now knight f3. If c4, e5, things are a bit murky. So knight f3, clamping down, but now look, g5, bishop g3, and h5. Holy cow! Look at this. You have to be careful you don't let Black trap your bishop. Well, maybe h3 deserves the most consideration. In the game, White played h4, trying to aggressively exploit the Black early kingside pawn expansion. And on g4, she rolled her knight back to d2, which also looks very reasonable. Now here, Black played in continued aggressive fashion with the e5 and bishop to b5. This puts a pin on the knight, threatens to capture on e5 a couple of times, but perhaps rolling the knight to b3 might have been good. Anyway, after pawn takes, the bishop went to d7. Now here, White played pawn to c3, but this is a bit slow. Maybe the best idea was knight to b3. That way, you leave c3 available for the other knight, and this knight might go to c3 to e2 and help fight for the f4 square. This might have been a little bit more accurate plan. Also, the queen might be able to come to d3. So, let's take a look. But in the game, c3. This reinforces the d4 pawn. Perfectly understandable. But now came queen e7 check. And here, White was a little bit optimistic. Perhaps the best move would have been queen e2, going ahead and trading queens, because Black has pretty aggressively expanded and created some pawn weaknesses. But in the game, king f1. White has dreams of getting a rook to e1 and trying to pin the king and queen. But then came a6. Black could have considered castling, and then after knight a3, continuing, having said A, why not say B, C, and D? And Black probably is equal, maybe even slightly better. It's hard to assess. But in the game, a6, putting the question to the bishop. Well, didn't want to give up the bishop yet for the knight, so the bishop came back, castles, but now we know where you live. So, pawn to b4. It's game on. Knight to h6, and then knight to b3. Perhaps the immediate a4 was a better way to fly. But knight to b3, bishop to f5, excellent move, looking to trade the light-squared bishops. Pawn to a4. Now, queen h7 would have been a good idea, forcing White to exchange bishops, or play bishop back to e2. Maybe bishop e2 is not a bad idea, but that could get a little tricky after rook e8. In the game, after a4, Black traded, and on queen takes, played bishop g7. So now it's Black who should consider offering a queen exchange with queen h7. But instead, not appreciating the storm clouds developing on the other side, played bishop g7, connecting the rooks. But then b5. And one of the points of having the knight on b3 is you don't allow this knight to go to a5. Well, pawn takes should have been replaced with knight to b8, trying to hold the fort, but then after knight at 1 to d2, White would already be a bit better. But in the game, after pawn takes, opening the a-file proves to be simply suicidal. The knight goes back to b8, and knight to d2. Rook at h to e8. Now you'd like to run down and penetrate with your rook, but you don't want to get checkmated. So king to g1. Now Black plays f5, but really doesn't have time for such luxuries. he should have been more focused on exchanging queens. Then on queen g6, bishop f8, queen takes h5. This would be a pawn sacrifice, but queen takes b5 would recoup the pawn, but then bishop f4. And black has problems. Once the knight moves, the g4 pawn falls. The passed h pawn should be quite strong. For example, knight back, queen check, something interposes, not the knight, because that would be downtown checkmate. So probably, let's say, the queen. But then, if nothing else, you could simply trade, and maybe king over, or simply start going with the passed pawns. Possibly even g4, if you're feeling a bit frisky. Why not? But anyway, in the game, after f5, well, then came very powerful pawn sacrifice. Pawn to b6. The sole purpose of this sacrifice is to simply open the diagonal from g3 to b8. Also strong was bishop f4, threatening the bishop g5 skewer. But b6, I like it, because after pawn takes, bam, rook to e8, and the pin on the black knight is not pleasant. So we can see the knight on b8 is pinned, it's attacked twice, and the London bishop has finally come into its own and has total control over the diagonal. Well, queen e1 check. A better try was to flee with the king and unpin the knight. For example, king d7. But then queen b5 check. Attacking the d-pawn. The only move here would be king e6, continuing to flee. If knight c6, queen d5 check would be a little bit brutal because queen takes d6 checkmate. Once again, we see the power of the London bishop. After king d7, queen check, king e6, but then you could switch gears and play rook a7. On rook d7, take the pawn on b6 check. When the king continues to flee, the knight would cartwheel in, and you can see the white pieces are working and coordinating very, very nicely. The black position is just bit by bit getting plucked apart. The advantage at this point is only +3, but you can see king safety. This king is exposed. This king is one move away from hiding on a moment's notice and has plenty of defenders. But going back to the game, after rook a8, the black queen came flying in to give check. But this didn't do anything except force the king up to h2, leaving the black queen under attack and the knight on b8 under attack. Well, queen e2, offering to trade queens, but rook takes b8 check, and rook takes b7 check. Now this is really bad news, because the king does not have a good place to go to. For example, king c6, rook c7 check, mate. If king e6, that cuts the protection for the black queen and allows queen takes queen check. Well, I don't think we need to follow that variation out to mate. So in the game, after rook takes b7 check, the king went back to c8. Well, of course, the situation is hopeless. White is a piece ahead, and the black king is exposed. The game did not last much longer. Rook check, and then rook e7 check, plucking the queen. King went to a8. If king to c2, of course, just simply queen takes queen. After king a8, white rushed to grab the queen. Why not? Be happy, you're winning the game. However, truth of the matter is, after king a8, even stronger was rook a1 checkmate. Nonetheless, queen e2 was good enough to bring about resignation. Mate will still happen very, very shortly. So, but what about this opening? Let's go back and take a look. 2 bishop f4, la-di-da, everything's normal. You're getting ready for another normal London type game, and your opponent whips out f6, which the first thought is, moving the f-pawn early, that looks bad, but anytime they do play the f-pawn, got to be cognizant of the fact that they want to play either e5 or g5. What actually happened in the game after e3, knight c6, knight f3, g5 was a bit frisky. And then on h5, you could either do what Fei did in this game, which is play h4, counterattack the pawn, or you could play the more restrained h3. I kind of like what she did actually, because this really clarifies the pawn structure, and after knight back e5, bishop e5, that put a pin on, and after pawn takes, here though, I think the knight b3 move would have been a definite, moderate improvement, and I think would leave white with a slight edge and chances to exploit the weaknesses in the black position, notably the f4 square. Also, white has a little bit of a lead in development, possibly. So, another very interesting game that led to the black king getting toasted.